Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I'm so excited if you are joining me live. I love getting on here, talking about quilting, answering your questions live. But if you're not watching live, no worries. You can always leave your questions in the comments. But for those of you that have marked your calendar, showed up at Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, Jessica is here monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, you can leave them there and I will answer them at the end. I love these live chats. It's just a fun way to connect and get to answer your questions and, I don't know, just get to do some quilting fun, for work, which is kind of crazy that I get to do that. So sorry I wasn't here last week. I was in Florida teaching at a magnificent guild, a huge guild. It was a great trip. And then back this week, and then next week I'll actually be gone again because we'll be going on spring break. But then I'll be back and I'll be in town pretty regularly for a couple months. So looking forward to, continuing the live chats. So today's live chat, I'm going to go over tips on how to pick out threads for your quilts. I know this is a topic I've talked about before, but man, I love playing with threads. I love talking about threads. And picking out colors is one of my favorite things to do, especially for the Free Motion Challenge quilting alongs that I do, the video series where we quilt together on a panel. Picking out the threads is kind of my favorite part to know that's, what I like to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my process and give you some examples of quilts with different thread colors, and you can play around with that. And then also tell you about some new things that are coming up, and then also go over, the next challenge. So lots of fun stuff. I'm so glad you're here joining me, so let's get right into it. So first of all, for those of you that live in the Kansas City area or plan on coming through the Kansas City area, especially in June, I hope you'll consider coming to our quilt walk. It's kind of like our outdoor quilt show where you wander in and amongst the cute little shops in downtown Liberty, where our shop is located, to get the pieces of a free pattern and see quilts, and we have door prizes and giveaways, and it's a really fun event. So if you happen to be around, I hope you'll join. That is from 9 to 3, somewhere around there. There's links in the description, and you can check that out if you want. After the quilt walk, we have other things going on. So the whole next week, we'll be doing long arm classes and have a great staff helping out with that. And I love teaching on a long arm, so that's going to be fun. And then June 4th, I'm having a dinner and a trunk show. So this is like, come eat a really good meal, have some drinks, look at the quilts, and I'll be doing a little trunk show. So excited about that. There's a few spots left for that, so you want to make sure that you check that out if you're interested. And then the classes themselves are mostly full, but there's a couple spots here and there, so you can check that out too if you're interested. The dinner is going to be the first time we've ever done this, and we're kind of excited. It's at a really nice location right across the square from our shop, and we're going to have food catered in and just a way to kick off our long arm celebration. So super excited about that. Again, if you have any questions, you can, check out the website, contact us, and we can answer those for you. But really, really fun in June. I know right now it's hard to even think about summer because we're in March, but I'm seeing glimmers of spring, a little bit of green coming up in the yard, so it makes me so very happy. And hey, since the last time that we've talked, it's been 2 weeks, I've released 2 new Midnight Quilter episodes. Y'all, I'm so proud of myself. Doing the Midnight Quilt Show was so much fun with Craftsy, but when they decided to not do that show anymore, I decided that's fine. I can do my own, and kind of released some, but never really got going. Well, this year is the year. So we have had 2 come out. The first one that came out was the bouquet quilt, and that is such a fun project. If you haven't seen it, you can check out my YouTube channel. It's a great way for pillow panels or large print fabrics. And so in that, I kind of go over how to make it and put the quilt together. It's actually pretty easy. It's just half square triangles and a little bit of piecing, which is pretty fun. And then for that particular episode, I had 2 different color options because I know not everybody is into pink. I tend to lean more to the blues and the greens, but there's 2 different color options for that kit. And of course, patterns, and watch a tutorial and you'll see how it comes together. And then my favorite, which came out just a couple days ago, the Bargello quilt. And for those of you that aren't sure what Bargello is, it's a technique where you make strip sets and then you rip it strategically to create this look of movement. And when I sat down and decided, I want to do Bargello, I thought, I want something easy. So it's like baby steps into Bargello. I'm sure if you fall down that rabbit hole of looking at Bargello quilts online, you'll see there's so many different styles and layouts, but this was meant to be an easy beginner way to try that. So if you want to watch that, again, check out my YouTube channel. Or you can go to quiltingismytherapy.com. All the videos for anything that is on my YouTube channel is on the website as well. And you can find all the patterns and kits and anything you need. anything to make your little heart happy. All right, let's talk about thread colors. Oh, I am such a nerd when it comes to thread. I like to joke that I like to collect thread the way most people collect fabric. So it's definitely one of my favorite things. And then picking out thread for your quilt top, again, I love it. I love that process of narrowing it down and kind of thinking through it, but I know it can be a struggle for some quilters, especially if you haven't done it before. So throughout these pictures, I just want to give you some practical tips for picking out the thread colors for your quilt. However, before we get into it, I got to tell you that there's no wrong answer. It's much like picking out the fabric for your quilt, right? It's all personal preference. So if you're looking at a thread and you're like, I want this color, then use it, right? It's your quilt. You should be super happy with it. But I'll tell you what I do and what works for me, and then you can kind of see how you feel about that and what works out with you. So when you're looking at your quilt top, and this is the first picture I have, it's just the Quilt Love quilt from an earlier Midnight Quilter episode. Before I even get started in picking out thread, I kind of ask myself, do I need one thread color or can I use multiple? And you might think, well, always use multiple because that's better, but think about edge-to-edge designs if you're going to have it just done all over, or you're going to all over design, or you're just like, I want to pick one thread color. I don't want the drama or the ordeal of picking out the different colors. So if that's the case, if I'm going to just use one thread color, I like to look at the whole quilt and kind of get an idea how much lighter areas and how much darker areas are there. I think the artistic term is value, but is it mostly medium? Is it mostly light? Is it a mix? And then I pick a thread that's going to kind of hit to the middle of that. So if we look at this Quilt Love quilt, it's mostly white, right? There is a little bit of the darker red and some lighter pink, but the bulk of it is that white background. Now you might think white thread, totally fine, but I actually would use on this, and what we quilted it with was a light pink. So for me, rarely do I use white thread on a quilt. I like to pull out some kind of color in there and use it. Now, even though it is not exactly white, it's going to be softer on the darker fabrics and not show up too much on the white. And so I think even looking at the quilt, you can kind of see the texture of the quilting, but it's not like it's taking away from the piecing there. And here's an up close picture of it. And I mean, it's a light pink. It's like a cotton candy pink by Glide, and I love it. So don't be afraid to look at some of those colors that might not seem right off the bat the perfect color, because once you take that thread off the spool and you kind of lay it on the quilt, that's where you're going to see how it's actually going to look. So again, if like this particular quilt was in the book that I did with Tula, lots of lighter colors. I mean, there is that pop of orange and there was some darker colors on there, but I knew that I was going to do a wavy all over design over most of the quilt. So I knew I had to pick one thread color. And for this one, I did a light yellow. So light yellow is kind of my go-to color. I call it magic yellow because it looks good on everything. But again, it's not going to be too stark on the white fabrics, and it's going to be a little bit softer on the contrasting fabrics. And even though if you look kind of towards the top of the picture where that darker, colors are, it's still not going to be too drastic. Again, you could totally get multiple threads, totally fine. But in this particular example, we're just talking about one thread color. This particular block was from our Build a Quilt block of the month. And when I was looking at it and quilting, looking through my pictures, that's kind of how I prepare for this. I just go through all my pictures and pull out the ones that are applicable to what we're talking about. But there's a lot of medium colors. It's not super light, not super dark. And so I opted for like a corally color that's in the medium range. So really playing with the value that's mostly over the whole quilt, and then picking the thread color is going to blend that. So even though here I've done some custom quilting, I'm still using the one thread color over the whole thing. And you can see a little bit closer here. The reason this works, so even though I'm using that corally kind of pinkish color, the reason it doesn't look too distracting on like that dark tan is that it's similar in value. It's kind of a medium lightish color. And so you can get away with using contrasting thread, especially if it's the same value. And we'll see some examples of that here in a second. Another example of the same thread color, this is again the light yellow. And the reason I love showing this picture is it really gives you an idea of how the color of fabric that you're using the thread on really changes the look of the thread. It's so thin, it just kind of absorbs a little bit of that color. And I'm sure there's a technical term for that, but for the most part, I know that in the purple blocks, it might look slightly different than it does in the background. And you really when you're looking at your quilt and trying to pick out your thread, you really kind of have to remember that we're going to be seeing it on all those different fabrics. So again, I love that light yellow, light pink, light gray, something like that, for especially quilts that have a lot of white background to them. So, and I have to pause and say, this just comes from experience using threads. There's been plenty of times I've picked out thread colors that I didn't love. I just don't use them in my slideshow. Another example of the light yellow, but I love it because in this particular quilt, which is Peaks and Valleys by Tula Pink, there's, you know, all these different colors of fabric. But since the prints are busier, it kind of helps camouflage the thread color. So you can get away with using a contrasting thread color a little bit more on a print as opposed to a solid. So for instance, even though this quilt has that bright pink and that bright blue, dark blue, using that light yellow over it just really just kind of hides into all those colors. So again, I kind of play when I'm picking out color, it's mostly value of the whole quilt, but also is it solids or prints, because that's going to change it a little bit. Speaking of solids, this particular quilt was from the Midnight Quilt Show. I can't remember the name of it now, but there's a lot of different colors. This whole quilt was rainbow, but it's mostly medium to dark. There wasn't a whole lot of light colors on there, so I pulled out an orange thread. When you're looking at a quilt and you're like, oh, what color thread should I use? Well, what's your favorite thread or fabric color? And using that kind of as a guide. So if one of you that are watching show me this quilt and are like, oh, what thread color should I use? If I said, well, what's your favorite color? It's blue, then a medium blue would look just as good on here. Orange was just a fun opportunity to use a different color. I wanted to switch it up a bit. So there are times though when you want to match the thread color to the quilt. For instance, if you're working with a very graphic solid quilt, such as the Westward quilt, this was also an earlier episode of the Midnight Quilter. In this particular example, there is so many, there's dark and there's light, and I knew that I was going to quilt it more custom style, so I knew that I could switch threads and have them match those different fabrics. So for me, I do like to use different colors of thread and match it to those prints to get that beautiful texture, but sometimes you don't have to. It just really depends on your preferences, how much time you have, what thread colors you have laying around, all that fun stuff. But as you can see here, and it's kind of hard to see, but in the blue section where there's that red square, I actually used red thread to kind of pull out that color. And even though it's contrasting, it really isn't very noticeable, especially when you're just looking at the whole quilt, because it's the same value. So again, if I'm quilting that blue section and I don't have quite that right blue, I can check for other colors that are the same value. Because I will tell you that thread is kind of like fabric. You can have 100 different spools, but you won't have the exact right color you want. So being comfortable working that out will help you out there. So again, another example of when matching thread color to the background. This particular quilt by Tula Pink, obviously very graphic. It has the black and the white, and matching the thread color just lets you see that texture. When I say texture, or you hear somebody say, I love the texture of quilting, it means that you can see the shadows, you can see not just the thread, but the texture or the creation or the, texture of the quilting. In this particular example, matching black and white thread to that area is just gonna help give me that best texture. So even though at the very beginning of this, I'm like, oh, I rarely use white on white, this would be an example of when I would, or black on black. Usually I will a little bit of contrast to see the quilting, but for here, definitely matching the same color. Now let's play a game, and let's just imagine that I was gonna only use one thread color on this quilt. If I had that black and that white, but only one, I'm gonna go with a gray. So I usually split the difference, not all of one or all the other. I usually split the difference and kind of hit it in the middle. But here you can see a little bit more close up. Now, when it talks about the kind of thread and the weight of thread, that's also a personal preference. That's a whole nother thing. But I will say that if your thread is thicker, like Glide, the 40 weight or a 30 weight, it's gonna show up more. So it's gonna be not quite as forgiving as far as going over a range of colors. This particular quilt, I'm pretty sure this is Glide. 40 weight has a little bit of sheen to it, but just blends in really nicely into that solid background. All right, so I have some pictures. I took some pictures of a quilt I quilted a while ago, and so to show you the process of how I pick out thread colors. So when I'm looking at a quilt, I have this quilt with the blue and the gray and the white. My little routine, and I gotta tell you, sometimes when I say this stuff out loud, I realize I sound a little neurotic about my threads, but this is a safe place, right? You still love me. It's fine. It's totally fine. So the first thing I do is I pick out at least 3 threads that are safe bets, that are like, okay, this could totally work. So I'll pull out my thread card, or I go to my thread collection, or I'll go here at the event center where our offices are. We have every Glide thread color in our shipping room, so it's pretty fun. So I'll pull out 3 colors. So here I pulled out a gray, a blue, and a white. Pretty standard, right? Because I have gray, blue, and white. And then you need to take the thread off of the spool and let it kind of pool on the fabric, because you need to see what just a single strand looks like. You can't just look at the spool because it's not going to be quite that dark. It's going to be lighter because it's just going to be one. So after I've done that, then I pick a couple, kind of lay it out, but then I'm going to pick a couple of unexpected colors or wild colors, things that I don't think I'm probably going to use, but I just want to see it. And so here I threw in a pink and a green, even though there's no pink or green on the quilt. Okay, so once I have those laid out, then I start looking at the thread colors in each of the fabrics. I want to see what's it going to do in the blue and the white and the gray. Again, I know this is sounding a little involved, but it lets you get an idea of where it's going to show up and where it's going to hide. So most of those are Glide thread. That pink is a So Fine thread, so it's 50 weight. It's a little thinner. It doesn't have that sheen, so I know that it will blend in a little bit more. And so I'm kind of looking at them, not making any choices yet. I'm not like committing. I'm just playing the field with the threads. And then it's time to start knocking them off, scooting some of them out. It's kind of like The Bachelor, but for thread, right? You must go. You get to stay. So the first one that got kicked out was the gray. It's too dark. For me, I like to err on the side of lighter thread on darker fabric. So here, seeing that it's a little bit darker than that background fabric, I'm like, ugh, even though it looks good in the gray, it's just a little too dark. So that one's dead to me. Then I decided the blue needed to go as well. I love that color blue, that light turquoise. Oh, it's such a nice one. But I just thought it was a little bit too bright, just a little different. So that just left 3 options, my linen color, and then the green and the pink. So when I get to that point, I'm like, okay, linen would be the one to go with, that middle cream color. But I'm like, oh, that green looks pretty fun. Even though there's no green on the quilt, it does pull out a little bit of that blue in the blue. It pulled out a little bit of the gray, and it looks nice in the background. So it will give me a little bit of contrast so that the quilting will show without overwhelming. So after narrowing it down, looking at the options, and that came down to those 2, and it was like, ah. So I could have went with cream. That would have been a safe option, but I end up doing the green. So this is kind of a backup picture of that little wall hanging. It's a little home quilt. You'll probably see this on an upcoming episode of Midnight Quilter. But again, from far back, from looking at the quilting, I feel like you can see the texture, but it's not like, oh my gosh, the quilting is overwhelming that piecing, because that's definitely not what I want to do. But then you can see it close up of the thread. So again, just not the expected color I meant to go with, that pale mist, but man, it added just a little bit to the background. I loved it. So when you're picking out thread colors, though, you don't have to pick one thread color for each and every fabric. You can usually find a thread color that will work over a range of fabrics. So this particular picture I pulled out because it's from one of our Build-A-Quilts from prior years. This was actually from 2020. And throughout the Build-A-Quilt, or our block of the month, we have so many different fabrics. Well, then I'll pick out a thread collection towards the end so that you can know what threads match it. So looking at the prints, these are the ones I ended up going with. The lighter cream that kind of will go over the tan and the cream, and then I have the gold, which will look good on the gold and the orange, and then that pale mist again, which we've already seen, but over the 3 prints. So don't feel like I need 9 different thread colors. You can probably find one thread color that will go over a range of fabrics. And then if I had to just do one color for this, I would go with like that lightish tan. Again, it's a little bit darker than the background, but not too much. And then that medium value will help it kind of hide in the rest of the prints. So again, no right or wrong answer. That's just kind of giving you a little peek into what's going through my head when I'm playing with all my fun thread colors. All right, we saw a picture of this quilt already, but now we're going to kind of like see more pictures of quilting and talk about the thread colors I picked. And this is a particular one where I did orange in the background. You don't have to only do one thread color, of course. If I wanted to do one section in one color and one section in the other, that's totally fine. But I think it's just really nice because you can see that texture on the background. But there's that orange thread again. So I love it because it's fun and unexpected. It is going to show up a little bit more on the dark prints, but it doesn't look too bad on the light, and it gives it a nice, beautiful look. I know I already kind of said this, but my rule of thumb is if I can't decide between thread colors, let's say I'm picking out colors, it comes to two, and I just cannot pick. They both look great, or I'm not sure which one would be better. My rule of thumb is to go with the lighter option because lighter thread looks better on darker fabric than vice versa. That's just my opinion, but if you ever go to a quilt show and you look at all the long arms that are set up, most of them have dark fabric with bright thread because it just looks so nice. So again, if I'm going to have contrasting thread, it's going to be lighter, not darker. And I think that's because when the thread is dark, you don't get that texture or that shadow, you just see the line, and it's really easy to see any mistakes. Now, that always makes it difficult when I'm filming for like the Free Motion Challenge quilting along or my quilting videos, because I do use darker contrasting thread so it shows up on the camera. But man, everything shows up, every little mistake. So it's a little humbling there. Again, orange thread, this is a little bit more of a lighter orange over all those different colors. And you can see that, you know, it looks nice in the white and in the lighter colors, but even in the dark blue, it's not too drastic. So the more you work with them, the easier it gets to pick out thread colors. Now, what's funny about all this is if you were to drop me in a quilt shop and have me pick out fabric for a quilt, no way. I'm not good at that. I don't like to do it. I need the quilt top and then I can match threads to it. So, and I just know that's because it's something I don't do very often. So anyway, this particular quilt, lots of colors going on, lots of prints, strips. I knew I was going to do a bunch of different quilting designs. And so when I was looking at that, I'm like, dishing my threads, I could have done blue or yellow, but I end up going with red. I don't know what it is, but anytime I get away with using like a thread I don't get to use very often, like a bright red, then it always makes me happy. So again, it's going to show up a little bit on some of the areas, but for the most part, it's just going to blend into the rest. So don't be afraid to be a little adventurous with those thread colors. Now, I will tell you, if I'm quilting a quilt, doing some custom quilting, and I know that the thread is going to contrast with a certain area, I will usually try to do some quilting designs that are a little bit more basic or simple, something that doesn't have a lot of traveling so that I don't get that thread buildup. So the design I'm picking also depends on the thread color as well. Now, what happens if you pick a thread color and you don't like it? That is going to happen. In this particular quilt, I haven't even told Allison Glass this, but I quilted this quilt for Allison Glass, and I started in the bottom right corner. And I really wanted the quilting to show up because I was doing all this interesting quilting, but the background was this linen kind of fabric, and this is one of the few times where I was like, oh, the lighter thread was just a little too light. So I realized after getting a couple sections done, I'm like, ooh, okay, I want to do something different. Instead of ripping out all that quilting, because that's just not going to happen, I continued on in that bottom right corner, but then switched to something that matched in the center. And then, of course, if once is a mistake, then twice is a design choice. So I just use that thread color again in the opposite corner just to give it an even look. And then so there's going to be times that you pick out the thread and it doesn't quite work. I mean, the quilting looked great. I love the quilting with the lighter thread on the darker fabric, but it just contrasted a little too much and distracted a little too much from her fabrics. So there are times it's not going to work out the way you think. But when all is said and done, I think it looks fine. When matching thread colors, though, when you have strips like this, it can be such a, I won't say a pain, but when you have solids with a lot of different colors, it's hard to match, especially when I have strips like this, light and dark. So there are circumstances where I will just bite the bullet and do a lot of different thread changes. In this particular quilt I did for Tula Pink, there were so many thread changes and stops and starts because all those strips in between were different ones. So for instance, if somebody is making a quilt and wants to put a black solid border with a white inner border, just remember, you're gonna have to either quilt those with matching thread color or just do one over the whole thing. But sometimes it's a little bit more involved, but definitely worth it when you can see the texture of the quilting. And then also when you're looking at your threads, you have to remember, of course, I already said this, but it's going to take on what it's around, right? So this is a dark navy background. But what I think is pretty cool about this is we can see that gold, of course, bright gold really shines off of there with those leaves because it has contrast, but it's lighter. But next to the gold where I have swirls, that's actually a dark purplish gray. And then moving on to the right, that's actually just a dark gray. So the more you work with colors or seeing what they look like on the fabric really kind of gives you an idea of how that's going to show up or the effects that you're going to get. So same background, 3 different thread colors. I think they all look great. It just depends on what effect you're going for. Those leaves, I wanted to be the focus point. I want it to be like, hey, look right here. So going with the gold, it was a great contrast there. And then again, if you have to pick a contrasting thread color, go a little bit lighter or go a little bit brighter. So this particular was a sample that for one of the challenges, and it was gray fabric, and I thought, ooh, a hot pink would look really nice on here. So give it a pop of color, a nice, interesting look, but not too much contrast. As, for instance, like I could have did a black on here, and that would have just not been as pretty. So again, looking at your threads and playing around with them. Now, I came across this picture when I was pulling stuff together for this chat, and I thought, that just makes my heart so happy. That's from Cathedral, from the Midnight Quilter. And so it just shows like, oh, you can pick out a different thread color for each section. But when it comes down to it, I didn't have to use a different thread in each section. I could have picked a lighter orange and a green and a blue to work across a range of those colors. And we can kind of see here a little bit of that. So try not to look at it like, oh, I got to pick out a color, it's going to be wrong. It's an extension of picking out the fabric for your quilt. It's a fun option. And then, of course, playing with the weights and the shades of your thread. Now, I'm not going to get too much into that because that's more like thread painting, but just know that the thinner the thread, the less it's going to show up. So even within this sample, in the upper right corner, it's light yellow, but when we get kind of towards the middle, you can see it's a little bit more medium yellow. And of course, the main elements are that kind of green and variegated yellow. So just knowing that the thickness of the thread is going to play a role there as well. So it's going to be great. Whatever you end up doing is going to look great. But again, the more you do it, the easier it's going to get, and just having fun with it. All right, so that's how I pick out threads, and I love doing that. But any questions for us? Now, I will be gone next week, but the week after, 2 weeks from today, I'll be announcing our next video series, our next Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. Super excited. I think I gave you all a sneak peek a couple weeks ago, so be sure to come back in 2 weeks for that. Can I use 40 weight serger thread on your long arm? Good question. I always suggest for my new long arm owners to use high quality machine quilting thread. The machine quilting thread is made to go in all different directions. It's made to withhold that. And serger thread, if you think about it, there's multiple that go into making that seam. However, I always tell my owners, if it works, it works. So if you try your serger thread and it runs without a problem, perfect, then you can use that. If it's not strong enough and it shreds and breaks, then switch to some machine quilting thread. When does the next FMQ challenge start, and when can we start to order? Love that. I kind of like already had that in my mind. I'll be announcing the next challenge, of course, in 2 weeks. The videos, and that's when you can purchase any of the products that you need, which are not required, but do allow me to keep doing the videos, so I do appreciate that. And then the actual videos will start in May, so May 9th. Will be the first video. So we'll have about a month to get your product, to get your quilt sandwich ready, and then we'll jump right into it. And we're going to be talking about border designs and kind of techniques for handling the borders of your quilts. What color of thread would I use on a quilt made of tones of green, warm, and cold? This is tricky because I really have to see the quilt because it depends on, are they prints? Is there a huge range there? But for the most part, I would say, if green is your favorite color, pull out a green that you like, or even something like limey might look kind of fun, a lime green to pull that out. But if its quilt is mostly green fabric, then you probably liked that green, so you could do green thread or yellow thread, something along that color. So, can you use a jelly roll to create a Bargello quilt? You absolutely can. In fact, most Bargello quilts are made with pre-cut strips. Jelly roll is just a 2.5 inch pre-cut strips of all the prints in a collection. In the Bargello quilt, Midnight Quilter, though, I did 4.5 inch strips so that the quilt blocks would go together quicker. So you can definitely use that. If you use different color threads, does it make mistakes pop out? Using contrasting colors of thread next to each other will help show off different elements. So if I've quilted something in hot pink and I don't love it, I'm going to put more stuff around it in hot pink until it just kind of disappears, which sounds counterintuitive. I get it. More similar things around it will help it disappear, or using a contrasting thread color will help it pop out. And actually, that is something that we'll talk about in the upcoming video series, thread colors and how to highlight or hide the elements of your quilt. What stitch length do I use for free motion quilting versus using rulers? Well, I don't actually use a stitch regulator, so my stitch length is more of an organic type length. It depends on the design, how big of a rush I'm in, how much wine I've been drinking when I've been quilting, all that kind of things. But usually I tell if somebody has a stitch regulator and they want a rule to follow, I usually say 10 to 12 stitches per inch is a good range. If you're doing really tight micro quilting, you might need to do more stitches per inch. The only benefit or one of the downsides of having tiny stitches is it's harder to rip out should you need to. So what weight thread do I use? All of them. I love all the threads. I have 100 weight, I have 12 weight, I have bobbin work thread, I have all the stuff. But for the most part, in all my stuff, or the 99% of the time, I'm using 40 to 50 weight thread. And that's actually what I suggest newer quilters start with too. It's strong enough to handle machine quilting, but it's still thin enough that it blends in and looks nice on your quilt. But ultimately, any weight's gonna work, anything you wanna use. Do I ever use variegated thread? So it's totally a personal preference. I rarely use variegated thread. If I were to use variegated thread, I would use a thread that all the color variations are different than the background. So for instance, black fabric with like a red and white variegated thread would look really pretty. The reason I don't want to use variegated thread on fabric that matches some of them is as you're quilting, you can't determine where it's going to hide or show up, and it kind of, I don't know, I don't love it personally. I love the look of variegated thread. I do. I just don't like using it, if that makes sense. But that's just personal preference. What color thread would I use on a black and white quilt? Those are always so striking, and then you're like, now I got to quilt it. If I had to use one thread color, I would do Cool Gray number 3 from Glide. It's a light gray, and the reason is it's not going to show up too much on the white, and it's a little bit lighter than medium, but on the black, at least it would be lighter thread on darker fabric. So that's always, the black and white quilts were always the hardest one when I quilted for customers because it's like tricky. But I will say, what if the quilt is 90% black and like 10% white, right? Then it's like going to be more towards the darker gray. So it also has to do with how much is on there too. I have a hard time determining value. How do I do that? That's a great question. I don't have any kind of art training. You need to know this. And the only reason I use the word value is because I heard Tula use it. We're just talking about light, medium, and dark. And so I know that some people will take a picture on their phone and put it in gray, because that will, if you put it in black and white, kind of let you see the value. And it really is just determined next to whatever it is. So like, is this paper light? Well, if it's next to a darker then yeah, it is, kind of thing. So for the most part, are they all similar in shade? Are they all like lighter on the spectrum or darker on the spectrum? That's kind of how I'm looking at it. I'm not overthinking it. It's not like I'm like, oh, this is a light medium with a, I just don't overthink it that much. Do I have new Glide thread cards? I don't think we have them yet. Nope. Glide is updating their new thread cards with some new colors. We're waiting patiently. So we're not selling any of the old ones. They don't have all the colors. But thread cards are a great option because you can see all the colors, but I can't really use that just for picking out the thread. I want to then pull out the thread and position it on there. Do I ever use 60 or 75 weight since silk is expensive? Yeah, so I've actually used Micro Quilter, which is 100 weight. And as you start getting into those like more extreme or finicky types, you just have to slow down a little bit or make some adjustments. And it's great, 60 or 75 weight, 100 weight, or even 80, it just disappears into the quilt. So it's really great if you have a very multicolored quilt where you're like, I just do not want the quilting to overwhelm the top. And I don't have a picture of it. It's in my head, and I know you can't see my head, but like I did a quilt one time that was applique, hand needle turned applique, the whole quilt. And it was like red and blue, and it was primary colors and very different. And so I just like, oh, I'm going to use a very, very thin thread so that the quilting can just blend into those range of colors. So yeah, sometimes I do use those thinner weight threads. So again, I can't tell you enough. It just depends on what you like, what you have laying around too. Like, I don't know, I've got an orange thread. I guess this is the one I'm going to use. So I said sometimes it's just the thread that's closest to me that gets picked. But when you're working with your quilts, just know that as long as you like it, that's the only thing that matters. And the more that you work with it, the more you play with your threads, the more you find what does and doesn't work for your preferences. Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you hanging out with me for another live chat. Be sure to check out the Midnight Quilter episodes, especially the Bargello one, because I'm giving away a Bargello quilt, and you can learn more about that on my YouTube channel and check that out. And again, I won't be here next week. I will miss you guys, but I will be on the beach for spring break with the family. Cannot wait. But I'll be back the next week, which I think is the 30th of March, and that's when we'll do a big reveal of the upcoming new challenge, new video series. Until then, everybody, stay safe, happy quilting, and I'll see you very, very soon.